Our story begins with Noura, just an ordinary Chad like me who can beat up armies of men with nothing but his bare hands, and despite his bad boy reputation, he somehow still ends up winning the love and admiration of every girl in school thanks to his infinite Rizz and his inability to keep his tiny katana hidden. What the heck, and this all takes place in a very typical Japanese high school with nothing weird going on at all, where all the girls are armed with weapons in order to maintain their control over the school, while delinquent men have been turned into obedient Discord kittens at the hands of the fearsome Supreme Five Swords, the five most powerful girls in school, and the only ones allowed to carry swords. And despite this, once being an all-girls school, it has since gained a reputation of being able to turn even the worst delinquents into good girls, which is exactly what the Supreme Five Swords planned to do with N after he was sent to this school for beating up 40 students single-handedly on his first day at his new school. Noah gets a glimpse into how men are treated here when he meets Kusu, a fat boy with a Buddha-looking asshead who's forced to act like a girl in order to peacefully coexist with them. But when he tries to warn N that a similar fate awaits him, N simply shrugs this off and tells Kusu that all he really cares about is living a life of complete peace and freedom. But upon entering his classroom, N immediately has a bunch of swords pointed directly at him, led by Ren, one of the Supreme Five Swords, who warns Noah that the only way for men to survive in this school is to tuck their sword between their legs and hope they don't accidentally sit on it during algebra. But when Ren sees that no N is surprisingly unbothered by her threats, she tells him that he can either exist as a girl like the rest of the boys or leave the school, and rejects both options, however, as he refuses to be told what to do. He then swiftly maneuvers past Ren with lightning fast speed and pokes his head somewhere. I wish I could before complimenting the girl's bakery and leaping out the window like a true madman, but Ren proves to be just as wild as N as she leaps out the window too and chases after him, determined to correct his behavior before the end of the day. And as she unsheaths her sword and begins attacking him, and playfully dodges strike after strike while nonchalantly admiring and complimenting her swordsmanship, it turns out that as an orphan, N was adopted by a sadistic master swordsman who trained him ruthlessly, which eventually led to Noura entirely giving up the way of the sword. But thanks to his profound training, Noura recognizes her sword technique as mirror breathing, which allows Ren to enhance the power of her attacks by timing her strikes with her deep breaths. But when N gets a bit too smug, Ren manages to graze his cheek with a well-timed strike, and upon seeing how powerful she is, N decides to get serious and dashes towards her. At that same time, other members of the Supreme Five Swords watch the fight unfold from afar and are equal parts amused and intrigued by Noura. Meanwhile, Noura continues to deflect Ren's sword strikes with his blade-resistant gloves, but accidentally trips and suddenly finds himself backed into a tree with nowhere left to run, as Ren seizes this opportunity by ramping up her attacks. But when N's body reaches its limit and all seems lost, he suddenly finds an opening and manages to place his hand on Ren's waist. This catches Ren completely by surprise, and she compliments him for managing to even land a finger, but warns him that the fight is over and that she'll slash a new butt crack into his forehead if he doesn't remove his hand, But N simply replies that a sword can't do anything against his gun, as he unleashes his spirit bullet technique straight into Ren's body, sending her flying and promptly ending the fight. And when Ren then tries to go for her sword again, N effortlessly stops her and tells her that the fight has been decided. Meanwhile, one of Ren's subordinates named Nono arrives to save her precious mistress and smacks her on the head, causing him and Ren to accidentally collide. Ren's mask then breaks because of this, and while on the verge of crying, she vows to have her revenge and promises to one day end Nora's life. But this is just the beginning of his problems, as the other members of the Supreme Five Swords absolutely despise him and swear to correct Nora's behavior and make an example out of him. The next morning, Nora learns from Kusuo that male students are actually not allowed to leave school grounds without a permission slip, and although M might be able to get one from Ren, he'll also need to have it stamped by all members of the Supreme Five Swords, which makes N realize that men here are treated like prisoners. Later in class, N is greeted with a cold shoulder from every girl thanks to a new rumor going around school that Nur is a creep who will do anything indecent to win a duel, so Nir casually offers the girls some sweets to ease the tension, but they all just think this is part of some creepy scheme of his. Meanwhile, as Ren lays in bed recovering from a fever, she begins viciously hitting her bed while calling. And more worthless than a filler episode, suddenly Ren senses a presence coming towards her room and grabs her sword, only to find N casually climbing through her window, but he thankfully stops her blade in time and nonchalantly compliments her on how cute she is and how lucky she is and how lucky he was to get to smooch her. This of course completely flusters Ren, and Nura cunningly uses this as a chance to ask her for the permission slip, which Ren abruptly refuses, but when En jokingly mentions that he could use the slip to take her on dates, Ren suddenly changes her mind and gladly hands it over to him. Unfortunately, Ren's fever causes her to get a slip of her own, and when Nur tries to catch her, Nono arrives just in time to find them in a compromising position and immediately smashes the subscribe button, shutting down the whole dormitory section by section and activating more traps than a UGIO duel, which N just barely manages to survive. But his troubles continue, and he then bumps into Choka, the self-proclaimed head of the Junior 5 Swords, who readies her whip to teach No a lesson, along with Nono, who arrives shortly after with the same intention to punish and discipline Nura for his indecent behavior towards Ren. Meanwhile, the other girls in school excitedly watch as the fight is about to begin, while Satori, another member of the Supreme 5 Swords, happily wishes for no more to drop dead. But once the fight starts and the girls rush in, they struggle to keep up with fast movements, and he effortlessly manages to use their weapons against them. While criticizing their lackluster techniques, he then hits Nona with a spirit bullet that sends her flying right on top of Choka, fearing that Nur will do to them what he did to Ren. The girls both begin bawling their eyes out, causing even more horrible rumors to surface about N's creepy and indecent behavior. Because of this, the next day at school, Ren points her sword at N the moment he enters the class, while Kusuo and the other girls look upon in horror and disgust as Ren tells him that in order to protect the school, she'll be supervising his every move from now on, completely destroying any hope that N had of a peaceful school life later that night. While N reads manga that was smuggled in, Kusa warns N that marry one of the Supreme 5 Swords, whose plot is massive enough to have its own planetary orbit, is sure to come for N's head after he defeated Choka, her precious subordinate. But N is as unbothered by this as usual, and instead asks to learn more about the girl they call the Empress. In response, Kushu reveals that she was a new student that transferred to their school a bit before Nier, and single-handedly defeated both Ren and Mary at the same time with relative ease, and even called their power meaningless compared to hers. But upon hearing this, Nura is reminded of a similar person who once brought him to the brink of death. The next morning, Ren visits Nur at his dorm to begin her supervising duties, and even searches through his bag to make sure he isn't carrying any prohibited items. Suddenly, Mary shows up with Choka and accuses Nur of being a creepy loser who vandalized the girls' dormitory in search of more girls to torment. But Ren surprisingly defends N and insists that although he's a good for nothing, he wouldn't do something like that. But Mary is already so angry at him that she forgets to speak Japanese and ends up yelling insults in French while blaming Ren for being too lenient on this human-shaped pig. Those are her words, not mine. Seeing that things are about to escalate into a fight, Ren tells Nura to go to school without her, and although he doesn't usually take orders from flat shrimpy girls, he decides to just go along with it when Ren insists on fighting Mary alone. Meanwhile, Choka chases after N and begins attacking him relentlessly with her whip. But when N takes off his belt and stops Mary's attack, this causes her to immediately pass out and fall to the ground, and believes that he simply overwhelmed her with his strength, until he realizes that he had accidentally dropped his pants and unwillingly used his forbidden technique. No, that's a lot of damage. And after fixing his pants, No suddenly comes across Amo, who in the past had left him on the brink of death after N had refused to become his subordinate. N immediately rushes towards Amo to get his revenge, only to be stopped by a stupefied Mary as she yells that his Pokeballs are still. Oh, that's him, officer. And upon seeing the trauma that Nura's forbidden technique has caused, Choka Mary vows in French to end Nura's life once and for all. Meanwhile, Almo had managed to use this distraction to escape to a secluded area where she reflects on how she tried to recruit N to join her gang after he defeated a bunch of her subordinates, but he abruptly refused by punching her, which she easily counterattacked before Anne had a chance to see what hit him, and despite being effortlessly beaten down by Elmo's hands that sliced like swords, Anne still refused to back down until he was knocked unconscious. But back in the present, Elmo was mad that something in her that day had prevented her from killing Nur and promises to kill him for sure the next time, but it seems Mary is already beating her to it as Nur struggles to fight off against Mary's rapid and piercing rapier strikes, and no matter how he tries to approach her, Mary is always able to counter his attacks while staying safe distance away, and she even manages to land multiple piercing hits onto him. Meanwhile, Ren joins the party really late and finds Choka still trying to process N's surprise attack from earlier, and to make matters worse, Ren goes in the complete wrong direction while trying to find N and Mary all while. In AA, another member of the Five Swords quietly listens in on everything happening at that same time. No is quickly running out of hope that he can win this fight, so he desperately tries to rush down Mary but gets pierced instead. Surprisingly, her attack was blocked by a manga he had hidden under his shirt so that Ren wouldn't see it end, then uses the extra reach from the manga to hit Mary on the head and manages to get just close enough to use his spirit bullet technique on Mary, rendering her unable to go on fighting and granting him the victory. Mary then becomes frightened that Noah will do horrible things to her as he had done to the other girls he defeated before, but when he reveals that he has no desire to do anything to her, Mary misunderstands and quickly grows jealous as she believes that he doesn't want to simply because he liked the other girls more than her. Because of this, she attempts to entice Nero with her humongous plot mountains, and although he's as tempted as any cultured man would be, he finds the strength to hold back at the last moment. Upon seeing him control himself, Mary realizes that men aren't wild animals after all, unfortunately. However, Ren arrives at that very moment and begins violently attacking Noah as she mistakenly believes that he has once again done something creepy at the end of the day. However, Mary clears up the misunderstanding and gives Anne her stand, but only on the condition that she gets to supervise him as well. But when Ren hears those words, she angrily begins shouting that N is only hers to take care of, while Nur wonders why he somehow slips further from freedom after every episode. Sometime later, Warab, the eldest member of the Supreme Five Swords, returns from her vacation in Hawaii with her pet bear and is shocked to find Mary and Ren fighting over Nura, which they were supposed to correct because of this. Warab decides that Mary and Ren have clearly lost sight of their duties and that they must also be corrected, so she calls a meeting of the Five Swords but strategically plans it so that only one other member is able to show up at that time, and thankfully for her, Satori doesn't care at all and allows Warabadi to go through with her schemes of correcting N and the girls through an event she calls the Warab Olympics. And just a few hours later, N finds Kusu beaten and tied to a cross, and although he immediately wants to save him, Ren and Mary stop him since this could all be a trap. Suddenly, Warabi makes her appearance from the top of the school rooftop while laughing maniacally and announces to the plebeians down below that she'll free Kusu and even give no more her stamp if him and the girls are able to complete a set of challenges that Warabi has prepared for them. But when Ren and Mary confront Warabi about how she's betraying her fellow Five Sword members, she replies that they betrayed the Five Swords first by displaying affection for the enemy, which they embarrassingly try to deny, while N just nonchalantly picks his nose. Warabi then reveals her three musketeers, who are the three fighters she's chosen to compete against Nura and the girls in her Warabi Olympics. And out of nowhere, Warabi just randomly summons a giant sumo ring, seemingly out of thin air, and reveals that the first challenge will be sumo wrestling. As such, everyone is tasked with putting on sumo belts and fastening them tightly, but when N begins nonchalantly undressing in front of everyone, they decide it's probably best to put the belts on in private to spare anyone else from having to witness Nur's forbidden technique again. And since Nura actually has a lot of sumo wrestling experience, he teaches the girls how to properly tie their belts, but this proves to be rather humiliating for them, and as Ren is forced to endure Nura's hands uncomfortably close to a forbidden sushi box, she promises to end his life if his hands slip even a little, while Mary watches equally humiliated. And once it's Mary's turn, she begs Ren to do it for her to avoid En's curious hands, but Ren refuses to force her to endure the same humiliation afterwards. However, Mary is surprisingly jealous that Nura was more handsy with Ren. Then her back at the ring, the gang is shocked to find a camera crew following their every move as the whole event is being broadcast live to the entire school by Warab's subordinates, but while the girls are embarrassed to have their goods on display like this, N is completely unfazed as usual as he confidently walks into the sumo ring and demands that his opponents show themselves. But when N realizes that none of the three musketeers are wearing a sumo belt, Warabi tells him to look up while laughing maniacally again, and War's giant pet bear leaps from the ceiling and onto the sumo ring. And for once in his life, N freaks out as it's absurd to expect anyone to be able to wrestle a literal bear. But when Warab laughs and tells him that he has no choice but to fight or forfeit, N's demeanor suddenly changes, and he confidently walks towards the bear as he proclaims that although he's never fought a bear, he's also never lost a sumo wrestling bout, and doesn't plan to start now. And once the fight begins, N immediately lunges forward and places his hand onto the bear before unleashing his spirit bullet technique straight into the bear, but this is unfortunately far less effective than he expected. And as the fight continues, N dodges all of the bear's attacks while waiting for an opening. In a sudden swift move, N moves behind the bear, grabs it by its sumo belt, and miraculously lifts the giant fat bear up with all his strength as if he's carrying horrible teammates in a school group project. But while everyone is shocked to see him carry an actual bear, N reveals that he spent most of his childhood fighting and defeating grown men, which ultimately strengthened his physical capabilities to inhuman levels. But despite Nura's impressive strength, the fight isn't won by him carrying the bear out of the ring, but rather by the bear's sumo belt coming undone, which automatically disqualifies it and embarrasses it greatly. Such an unexpected loss causes Warabi to fall backwards as she can't believe that she lost for such a stupid reason, and in that moment she brandishes her weapon and tells her subordinate to prepare for a loud war. Suddenly Warabi surprisingly regains her maniacal demeanor as she announces that she will give her stamp to N as promised, but only if he manages to make it all the way to the senses impossible to penetrate, and appointed her 3 musketeers at each level along with 30 of her high-class subordinates that all look the same for some reason. Meanwhile, Inaba continues to eavesdrop and is intrigued by how Nu will accomplish this seemingly impossible task, but considering that he just wrestled a bear, I'd say anything is possible, and himself doesn't really seem that worried about overcoming the odds, as they tell him that they'll be joining the fight as well. Once the fight begins, Nura unleashes Choka and Nono onto their weaker opponents, and they surprisingly make quick work of them. Meanwhile, Nura decides to just go straight to the final boss instead of running through the school, but F1's finally face to face with Warabi. Nura warns her that once he wins, he intends to make her wear a sumo belt and broadcast it to the whole school. However, Warabi just ignores him and instead tells Mary and Ren that they are a disgrace to the 5 swords as their affection for Nura has blinded their judgment, but the girls still refuse to let Warabi do as she pleases and unsheath their swords as Warabi and her pet bear get ready to fight too. And while Mary heads downstairs to stop War's musketeers from making their way to the rooftop, Nura decides to take on War, brushes off her shoulder injury. However, and the 2 girls begin clashing with their swords, but as the fight progresses, Warabi seems to keep getting the better of Rim as she almost manages to slice her in 2 with a strike to her chest and also grazes her cheek. Meanwhile, Len using the sumo belt onto Warabi, but the girls adamantly refuse to let Nur humiliate Warabi in the same way he humiliated them and began chasing after him while Warabi and her bear still lay defeated on the ground. Sometime later, Ren recalls N's previous comment about her cuteness and decides to try and look her best for him. Meanwhile, Mary unleashes her secret weapon, her most expensive perfume, in hopes that N will catch a whiff and fall madly in love. But the girls of competition, as N suddenly has every girl within a 5 EM radius drooling over him, Thanks to his Chad performance in the World Olympics, Ren and Mary can only watch as N's fan club grows with frustration written all over their faces while Noah walks to school with a gaggle of fangirls trailing behind him, and once class time rolls around, the only subject on every girl's mind is N, and probably his forbidden technique too, but N is unfazed by all this female attention and begins to fall asleep, so Ren gives him a not so gentle reminder that it's not nap time yet, and throughout the rest of the day N finds himself chased by a horde of fangirls wherever he goes, and the only piece he's able to enjoy is when Ren and Mary scare off the other girls with their intimidating stares, and later that day, during lunch innocently, asks the girls why they're in such a bad mood, but instead of a simple answer, they unleash a whirlwind of fists upon him, and at the end of the day, the girls are sad that their efforts to impress N have gone completely unnoticed by him. Meanwhile, Warabe, who was stalking them all day, is shocked when even her pet bear seems smitten by Noura. Later that night, Noura is secretly watched by a mysterious girl as he chows down on food, but doesn't notice her presence and heads to bed early the next morning, and wakes up early for once and waits for the girls outside the dorm before they even arrive, and nonchalantly compliments them as soon as he sees them, which of course completely flusters them. But when Rin checks N's belongings afterwards, she's shocked to stumble upon a crazy photo of him and a Tory developing plot, which of course shocks Noura too. While the girls curse themselves for having ever trusted a filthy Herm protagonist, they then pull out their swords and start chasing N around school, despite him proclaiming his innocence. But in his panic flight, N crosses paths with Warabe and her pet bear, who surprisingly offer to lend a hand in, evading the wrathful girls by hiding N from them, and once the girls leave the once fearsome bear suddenly becomes a cute and cuddly companion. Afterwards, Warabe tells no more that Satori is probably trying to create cracks in his relationships with Ren and Mary, but for now N just cares about getting those incriminating pics from Satori, but to pull this off he's going to have to brave the girls' dorm again, which is a place now rigged with more traps than a spy movie, and Warabe warns him that stepping foot there again means risking serious punishment from Ren and Mary, but Noura says he's got a genius plan brewing in his noggin, then finds himself hanging upside down over a barrel of water while Ren and Mary beat him like a pinata, but Omar, stubborn as ever, refuses to let out so much as a whimper, so the girls continue to beat him until Candy comes out, but his clothes are torn to shreds instead, revealing deep scars all over his back. Thankfully, Warby shows up later that night to rescue him and chastises him for coming up with such a stupid plan, as it turns out that earlier that morning N had actually planned to get himself kidnapped by Ren and Mary so that he could sneak into the girls' dorms undetected, and after rescuing him from his cell with Robbie, and N reached Satori's room to search for the incriminating pictures or find clues to their location, but come up short afterwards. While walking through the dorms in search of more clues, Noura accidentally steps foot on a trap, sending a bunch of spikes flying towards him, but Noura manages to stay alive thanks to reflexes honed by a lifetime of dodging trouble. But when two girls then suddenly start walking down the hallway, Wari uses her quick thinking to accidentally sit on N in an attempt to hide him, which completely flusters her. Thankfully, however, the bear's adorable child steals the spotlight, diverting the girls' attention just long enough for N and the others to make their escape. But their luck continues to worsen as War's bear accidentally sets off another trap, summoning a colossal log flying toward them, which the Chad N miraculously manages to stop with his inhuman strength. A few hours later, the trio find themselves rifling through more of Satori's stuff in search of the pictures, but don't find anything. Suddenly, however, Satori's right-hand girl fires a poison dart straight at Noura, which Warby intercepts with lightning reflexes, but is still grazed by Satori herself, then emerges from the baths with her plot completely exposed, and is surprised to find that Warabe is now working with N, who she once despised, and as he looks at Satori's unsettling smile, N can't help but question the sanity of anyone who'd bring a sword in a bath. Satori then reveals that while N was asleep, she took the incriminating photos with the help of her right-hand girl, but when he suddenly woke up from the camera's flash, they had to force him back to sleep, And when N then questions why she would do this, Satori nonchalantly says that she doesn't have a reason and did it just because she finds N annoying. She then challenges N to a fight and heads out to the baths while he follows behind her and admires the view, I assume. Meanwhile, Wari decides to take on Satori's right-hand girl, but the poison dart from earlier is starting to take effect so. She stabs herself to fight off the dizziness, but despite this, the poison still makes her body feel heavy and sluggish, and Warby finds herself losing the fight more and more as it unfolds, and as Warby teeters on the brink of exhaustion, she charges in with calculated aggression only to falter and drop her sword as she is suddenly drained of strength, but Warabi refuses to go down, and as her opponent approaches in for the finishing blow, Warabi surprisingly blocks her attack by grabbing her hand and uses a judo technique to send her flying, disarming her opponent and simultaneously ending the fight in a single swift move. Meanwhile, Satori's emotionless gaze makes it impossible for Nur to predict her movements, allowing her to completely overwhelm him with her mastery of various different sword fighting styles, and Nan is barely able to dodge her rapid strikes as he sliced multiple times throughout the fight. But what's really holding Nur back is his inability to concentrate when he's got such plot and culture staring him in the face. That's when N realizes that he can also utilize his forbidden technique, causing Satori to lose focus as well as she's unable to stare directly at him, and Nura is able to capitalize on this to finally win the fight with a chat slap. Inava, the last member of the Supreme Five Swords, then uses her superhuman hearing to sense trouble from far away and arrives at the scene of the fight moments after it ended. Surprised by this, Satori plunges N beneath the water to hide him, but Inava knows he's there and tells Satori to bring N to the fountain in the yard. And once Inaba leaves, N immediately emerges from the water gasping for air and asks Satori why she tried to hide him, but she replies that he's far too weakened right now and would die to Inaba in a matter of seconds. And although No brushes this off, his body immediately gives up on him and he falls to the floor. And after the dust settles from their intense battles, Warabi and Noah find themselves hospitalized in the girls' dorm with a laundry list of battle scars. Meanwhile, Ren struggles to keep N out of her mind and even dreams about him regularly. So she decides to head to the torture chamber to give N another chance to explain the incriminating photos, but her plans take an unexpected turn when she crosses paths with Mary, who was planning to do the same thing, but since they're too embarrassed to admit that they both head to the cafeteria, instead pretending as though this was their intention all along, suddenly Satori arrives and voluntarily tells the girls the whole truth about what she did to N, and they feel bad for having ever doubted him. Meanwhile, once N's injuries have healed, he gets up and changes back into his clothes. Ren then unexpectedly arrives and immediately apologizes for what she did to him before N has had a chance to put his pants back on, and when she then catches a glimpse of N's sword, she EXP fails from embarrassment, but after she's calmed down and remorseful, Ren begs Nora to do anything he wants to her as punishment for wrongfully torturing him. However, Nora simply asks her to close her eyes, and as she prepares herself for a romantic moment, he just removes her mask instead, which embarrasses Ren even more for some reason. She then opens up to N and reveals the truth behind her mask facade, which all started when her father cheated on her mother and abandoned both of them. And in response, her mother told Ren to always wear and always wear a mask to hide her ugliness, but that all changed when N complimented her on her cuteness after her mask had broken, which gave her the urge to ditch the mask forever, but she lacks the confidence to do so. And upon hearing Ren's story, Anne decides to hand her mask back to her while encouraging her to find the strength to someday live without a mask. He then decides to open up about his past as well, and tells her that he's an orphan who was taken in by an old man who decided to train him harshly and relentlessly every single day. And as he tells his sad story, even Warabi can't stop herself from crying while eavesdropping, and just as everyone is wiping away tears, Mary brazenly walks in and immediately drops her uniform while apologizing to N and tells him to do whatever he wants to her, which he just nonchalantly refuses. Begone F. And after a long and exhausting day, N returns to his room and grabs his permission slip under his pillow, which now surprisingly has Satori's stamp, and as he looks at the slip, he isn't able to control his excitement as he's grateful to have joined a school filled with all sorts of crazy but fun people the next day. Inaba reports to the headmistress that Almo has left her room and has suddenly started eating more carbs to prepare for something, and upon hearing this, the headmistress immediately orders all classes to be suspended for the day. Meanwhile, on the school's rooftop, Amo confronts Satori about the incriminating picture she took with Nura and warns her that she's messed with the wrong person, as Nomura is only hers to take care of, however Satori says this. It's too late now, she can't do anything about it, but as she pretends to leave, she turns around and attacks Almo instead, who manages to avoid her attack and immediately shoves her blade-like fingers into Satori's stomach. Desperate to save Satori, her right-hand girl puts herself in harm's way to protect her and receives a devastating blow from Almo in the process. And as Satori looks in horror upon her right-hand girl, who's actually her sister, whom she always looked down upon, the emotionless Satori doesn't know how to react and lets out a gut-wrenching scream while crying her eyes out, but Almo is simply annoyed by this and immediately knocks her out. Hearing all the commotion, Warabe and her bear immediately arrive on the spot and prepare themselves to take on the monster that stands before them, but despite landing a few attacks on Amo, they can't break through her steel-like defenses and are ultimately defeated instantly by a single counterattack. Meanwhile, Nier is taking a stroll around school with Kushu when they bump into Inaba. Kushu warns En that despite being pint-sized, Inaba is actually the strongest girl in the school, but En non-Blai approaches her regardless, and Inaba moves with lightning fast speed to put her sword to En's neck. However, she puts her sword away shortly after as En falls to the ground, but she warns him that next time she won't put her sword away since he's already caused so much chaos at the school, and she's been entrusted to correct his behavior once and for all. And as they talk, Inaba reveals that although she is blind, she has superhuman hearing that allows her to perceive all things around her, and with this power, she was even able to determine that Nora and her were trained in the same sword fighting style, which she could tell by the way he used his spirit bullet technique, which was originally a sword technique. In response, Nora sarcastically congratulates her for being a genius, and Nava stoically responds with thank you, but their banter is cut short when En hears Warabe screaming in agony from the rooftop, and Inaba informs him that Amo is currently defeating all of his new friends because of him, as she explains how when Amo first transferred to the school she was cold and distant with everyone, but she did speak fondly of a certain person named Nura. But while she's blabbering on, she realizes that Nura has already left and that she's just been embarrassingly talking to herself. Meanwhile, Warabe begs Almo to kill her instead of her friends who have come to protect her, but almost slashes War's eyes instead so that she won't have to see her friends suffer. And when finally makes it to the rooftop, he finds everyone on death's doorstep. He rushes to War's side and desperately tries to call for help without realizing that the headmistress had sneaked up behind him. Suddenly she tells En that Warabe will be fine and points to another fight going on downstairs and urges him to go and stop Alo while she assists the wounded. Meanwhile, Inaba stands by quietly as Mary and Ren work together to attack Amo, but they're no whole match for her even with their combined powers. Ren is shocked by how Alma's whole body is like impenetrable steel, and Amo reveals that this is the result of her lifelong dedication to strengthening her body until it was honed with blade-like perfection. Once Ren and Mary are taken care of, Almo sets her sight on Nu and her friend, but then out of the blue Inaba swoops in and bluntly asks Nono if they are friends, and as she's frightened by her, Nono confirms that they are indeed friends, which is enough to finally motivate Inaba to interfere. But as she readies herself to fight, she wonders if meeting En somehow inspired her the same way it did the other girls. Meanwhile, Amo also prepares for the fight, but Inaba warns her not to take her lightly as she assumes her sword fighting stance, which creates a tense atmosphere that resembles a chilling mist. And with lightning fast speed, Inaba unleashes a flurry of 3 slashes in a single second, catching Almo completely off guard, but her victory is short-lived as Almo's automatic counterattack leaves her wounded and her sword shattered. Almo breathes a sigh of relief after realizing that Inaba's weapon was just a cheap toy for some reason, as a real sword would have surely killed her. But as she moves in to finish off Inaba, Nura swoops in and saves her, but his presence only infuriates Almo further. In a flashback, we see when Nura and Almo first met and how he teased her for being so cute despite Believing she was a boy, he even sneaked up behind her to playfully plan a smooch, but his attempt was swiftly stopped by Elmo's elbow. But despite this, Elmo quickly grew fond of Nura, and the two decided to become friends. But later that day, when Amo approached Nomura to give him a tour around the school, he refused because he already had plans, which caused Alo to lash out at his new friend as she told him that he should only associate with people worthy of his presence. Back in the present, Inaba puts her sword to Nur's neck once more, as if the showdown with Alma wasn't enough, and warns him never to interfere with her again. But since he rescued her, Inaba wonders if this means he considers them friends, which N immediately denies without wasting any time. But when he focuses on Alma once more, N knows that his only chance to win this fight is with his spirit bullet technique, but that if he messes up even a little, she'll counterattack him and end his life. And upon seeing Nur shaking, Ren grows frightened for him as well. But as she remembers how Nura's encouraging words helped her defeat Warby, she decides to do the same for him, as both Ren and Mary begin encouraging him to give it his all with newfound confidence, and immediately charges in ready to take down Alma once and for all. But she grazes him on his arm and dodges him perfectly, and as the fight continues, Nura can't seem to make any real progress, and he's eventually forced to his knees. But as Amo throws Nura's coat on his head and goes in for the finishing blow, and Ava yells at him to dodge towards her voice, ultimately saving his life to repay him for saving her earlier. She then tells N that his fear of defeat has made him fight half-heartedly, which allows Omo to parry his attacks effortlessly. But Inaba insists that if he believes in himself and does not fear death, he'll be victorious. These words remind No of his harsh childhood and how much he's had to overcome to become so strong, which strengthens his resolve to win this fight and avenge all of the friends he's made along the way. And as Noor prepares himself for round 2 and unbuttons his shirt like he's about to reveal a superhero costume, it starts to rain R, and I'll